In the last episode, Flotsam and Jetsam were coming off The Cold, an album that showed the band was still capable of delivering powerful music after years of instability. But behind the scenes, the lineup was changing again. Michael Gilbert had returned to the band, and then another major piece of the classic Flotsam puzzle came back into place. Kelly David Smith was back. And suddenly, Flotsam and Jetsam had something they had not had since the late 1990s, a lineup containing the core musicians responsible for albums like Quattro, Drift, and High. The timing could not have been more important, because instead of simply making another album, Flotsam and Jetsam were about to take a completely different approach. In 2011, Flotsam and Jetsam reunited with drummer Kelly David Smith, who had last appeared with the band on High in 1997. His return was significant because Smith was not just another drummer filling a vacant position. He was one of the founding members and an important part of the band's musical identity. With Eric A.K. Knudsen on vocals, Michael Gilbert and Ed Carlson on guitars, Jason Ward on bass, and Kelly David Smith behind the drums, the band now had a lineup that connected directly to one of the most interesting periods in Flotsam history. And according to the musicians themselves, something immediately clicked. Eric A.K. later described the writing process as feeling almost effortless, as if the returning members had simply stepped back into a familiar musical environment. The chemistry that had existed years earlier seemed to return naturally. But there was another challenge. How were they going to pay for the album? Flotsam and Jetsam decided to use crowdfunding through Pledge Music. Today, fan-funded projects are common, but at the time, this was still a relatively new approach for an established metal band. The concept was simple. Fans could contribute to the project before the album was completed, helping finance the recording while receiving exclusive access and rewards along the way. For Flotsam, it was more than just a way to raise money. It gave the band greater ownership and control over the album. The fans who contributed were also brought into the process through updates, videos, and behind-the-scenes material. In a sense, Ugly Noise became a collaborative project between the band and its most dedicated supporters. And that freedom may have helped explain why Ugly Noise sounded the way it did. Because this was not an album built around chasing trends. It was a Flotsam and Jetsam album made by musicians who had regained some of the old chemistry and who now had the freedom to follow it wherever it went. And then there was another familiar name connected to the album, Jason Newsted. No, he did not officially rejoin Flotsam and Jetsam, but he did collaborate with the band during the writing process. Newsted worked with Michael Gilbert on material and contributed songwriting, including lyrics and melodic ideas for some of the songs. The reunion never developed into a full-time return, but his involvement was still an important connection to Flotsam's past. So by the time Ugly Noise arrived in December 2012, the album had a fascinating combination of old and new. Kelly David Smith was back, Michael Gilbert was back, Jason Newsted was contributing to the writing, and yet the result did not sound like the band was simply trying to recreate Doomsday for a Deceiver or No Place for Disgrace. In fact, that was one of the biggest reasons Ugly Noise divided fans. Here's a funny story. When Michael Gilbert originally wrote the title track Ugly Noise, he wrote it on the piano before adapting it to the guitar. While he was making the demo, all the electricity in his house suddenly cut out. After investigating, he discovered a group of teenagers had broken into his circuit box and turned off his breakers. So then Michael Gilbert hopped into his truck to track them down. He eventually catches one of the boys and returns him to his parents. But then he thought he lost his files. But fortunately, he was able to recover his work only because he had been consistently using the command S to save his progress. Following the incident, he sent the demo to Jason Newsted, who wrote the lyrics, and from there, the track was complete. Ugly Noise was heavier, darker, more groove-oriented record than the classic thrash albums many longtime fans expected from Flotsam and Jetsam. There were thrash elements, of course, but this was not an album built around constant speed and aggression. Instead, the songs often felt more off-kilter and progressive. The album was closer in spirit to Drift than to the band's first two records, a comparison the band itself made at the time. The music had a more mature and experimental approach, with groove, atmosphere, and unusual arrangements playing a major role. And right from the opening title track, that difference was obvious. Instead of launching into a full-speed thrash attack, Ugly Noise opened with piano and atmosphere before developing into something heavier and stranger. Songs like Giddy Up, Runnin' High, and Rabbit's Foot, Carry On, and Rage show different sides of the band, while the album moved between heavy grooves, aggressive riffs, melodic passages, and progressive structures. For some listeners, it was a refreshing evolution. For others, it was exactly the problem. The biggest criticism of Ugly Noise was simple. It didn't sound like the Flotsam and Jetsam some fans wanted. After all, the return of Kelly David Smith and Michael Gilbert created expectations. For many listeners, seeing those names back in the lineup suggested that Flotsam might return to a more traditional thrash sound, but instead they delivered an album that was slower in places, more experimental, and much more groove-oriented. Some fans also felt the songwriting was inconsistent. The album could jump from heavy thrash riffs to piano passages to strange rhythmic changes, making it feel less focused than some of the band's strongest albums. If you came to Flotsam looking for another Doomsday the Deceiver or No Place for Disgrace, Ugly Noise could feel like almost a different band. And that title probably didn't help. Ugly Noise, it was not exactly designed to sound welcoming. But for the fans who love the album, those differences are exactly what makes it interesting. Ugly Noise has personality, it takes chances, doesn't sound like a band trying to relive 1986. And perhaps most importantly, it sounds like a band enjoying the process of making music together again. The chemistry between Gilbert and Smith was back. Eric A.K.'s vocals remained one of the band's strongest assets, and the songs had a darker and more mature atmosphere. For many fans, Ugly Noise also represented a continuation of the musical direction that began with Drift, a more progressive, unpredictable version of Flotsam and Jetsam. It may not be the easiest album in the catalog, but that is part of its appeal. This was Flotsam refusing to become a nostalgia act. And whether you love the album or not, that makes Ugly Noise one of the more interesting releases in their later discography. Fixed on the sky. So here's a completely different piece of Flotsam and Jetsam trivia. Eric A. Knudsen is the biological father of Creighton Fraker, who appeared on the February 22nd, 2012 episode of Fox singing competition American Idol. One of those strange connections you probably would never expect to find in the history of a Phoenix thrash band, but I just wanted to include that. But something more important is going to happen because a longtime member is going to leave. Unfortunately, the lineup's stability did not last long. Jason Ward, who had played bass with Flotsam and Jetsam for years, stepped away from the band after Ugly Noise because he was no longer able to commit to touring due to personal commitments. And behind the scenes, there was also tension surrounding the lineup changes and the involvement of Jason Newsted in the writing process. Kelly David Smith later explained that Ward had become unhappy with some of those developments and chose to remain home rather than continue touring. So once again, Flotsam and Jetsam found themselves dealing with another change. And this one will lead to a surprising development, because the next chapter would not simply be another new studio album. Instead, Flotsam and Jetsam were about to revisit one of the most important albums of their entire career. And they were going to do it with a returning bass player. In the next episode, we take a look at 2014's No Place for Disgrace 2014. Why did Flotsam and Jetsam decide to re-record a classic album? What had changed since the original version? And how the return of bassist Michael Spencer helped make this unusual project possible. That's coming up next in the Flotsam and Jetsam series. So I'm trying to get this done before the new one comes out. I may or may not finish it, but I'm going to try to crank them out. So check out the playlist, the entire history of Flotsam and Jetsam, reviewing all their albums and talking about them. So thanks for watching. See you in the next one.